There was a time before the first humans when water covered the earth. Over an endless expanse of sea flew Raven, bored and lonely, until finally the waters began to recede. Supernatural beings were already upon the first reefs to emerge. The newly formed islands soon became home to many creatures, natural as well as supernatural. It was a time when anything was possible. Boundaries of earth, sky, and sea were made non-existent. All beings were able to pass from one domain to another through miraculous powers of transformation. Generous forests carpeted the land, providing shelter and food for many different animals. Birds filled the skies, whales and fish swam the seas. Raven, through cleverness, trickery, and even outright theft, traveled about changing things to his liking. He brought fresh water to the islands. He even stole the sun to provide light for the world. But now he was bored and restless. Things had become too settled. He craved mischief and set out for more adventure. After gorging himself on the beach at Naikun one day, he noticed a large shell half buried amongst the kelp, and unlike any others, strange sounds came from inside. Upon closer examination, he saw the shell was full of tiny creatures hiding in terror. Fortunately for these creatures, Raven was no longer hungry, so instead of shoveling them down his throat, he used his most tantalizing voice to coax them out into his new and wonderful world. They began to emerge. A few ran timidly back in, but eventually Raven persuaded them all to come out. He had discovered the first humans, the Haida. With Raven's help, the Haida and their descendants lived well on these generous islands. Great legends were born of both man and beast. They grew and prospered, skillfully falling into the rhythm of the seasons as nature had intended, never forgetting that they were just one small part of the immense circle of life. These islands of the Haida had truly become Haida Gwaii. A second flood covered the world. Some Haida escaped the rising waters in their canoes and rafts. As each canoe landed, the different tribes of the Haida came into being. Through the two floods and an ice age, they lived in harmony with the islands. Then, just over 200 years ago, a white sail appeared on the horizon. Things were never to be the same again. European and Indian civilizations have had similar beginnings, and yet, at some point, they began to go entirely separate ways. Guujaaw and his son Jaalen are 20th century Haida.
The Haida culture is built upon an intimate relationship and oneness with the land and seas. Civilization, it seems, is a concept that measures how far people can be removed from the natural world, how different we can portray ourselves from other members of the animal kingdom. This deliberate trend has brought us to the environmental crisis of the world today.
European traders brought metal tools, kettles, nails, and guns, and eventually disease. In a decade, smallpox cut the Haida nation of 10,000 people to a mere 600. The survivors were drawn into the civilized world. The natural resources of both forest and ocean were plundered under a foreign authority out of touch and seemingly spiteful of the natural world. Because our islands lie 100 miles to the west of British Columbia, the Canadian flag still flutters over our homes. The ruined village of Ninstance on Haida Gwaii is a silent witness to the early days. Crests carved on poles of cedar still stand proudly defiant, testimony to a village of around 500 people.
The images you see portray the identity of the people who lived here. People were placed in the burial chambers of the mortuary poles. Scores of totems have been taken away to museums across Canada, the United States, and even as far away as Europe. This face on the bottom of the pole would be someone in the life of these people. Different carvers had their own ways of making wings, like an insignia. Little remains of the noble who was placed upon the pole.
There is an understanding of death with the Haida, a strong belief in reincarnation, and an understanding of the different levels you go to when passing into the great beyond. Today's modern trappings can distract you from those beliefs, but the truths still remain. It was important for Haidas to live to the full so that when you grew old, you could sit and tell your story, and the children would stay and listen because it's interesting. And if you didn't have a story to tell by then you didn't have a place. Without knowledge to share, you're not of much use to anybody. The old people are the libraries of that time. They still remind us of our identity. It is hard to get a complete sense of who we are without having some background knowledge of how we came to be, what shaped our present condition, why, for instance, we now live in only 2 villages instead of several hundred, as did our ancestors. The poles here are not merely impressions of art, but an expression of a strong relationship to the earth. Today, as in the past, our inspiration comes from the world around us. Because these poles will not be artificially preserved, they remind us that life, death, decay, and renewal are all natural and necessary, even beautiful. The past is important, but for the future of these islands, we seek the balance where the impact of Western civilization and technology is not in conflict with the natural world and tradition. We are at a time when there are still places that seem to be in harmony with nature, just as our ancestors knew them, as they must be for our children. In our clan system, all Haidas, by matrilineal descent, are raven or eagle. Through intimate contact with the oceans and forests, we understand the powerful living forces of the islands. O Creek woman, let the salmon abound for me. On a final journey to pay their respects to Creek woman, wife of chief of the sea, their children, the salmon, fight their way upstream to the depths of the forest. It is on this arduous journey that the salmon has provided food for both man and beast. With the incentive of hunger, a black bear patrols the creek for the now plentiful salmon. Pouring their life forces into the foaming waters, the salmon finally make the falls and congregate in calmer pools to rest, before struggling onwards to their place of birth. But for the salmon, rest is not allowed. Nature has dictated that salmon should be numerous and ease the burden of hunger for other animals. And so it is with a mixture of joy and sadness we see them taken so near to their journey's end. But many do reach the spawning beds and eagerly look for a mate. Each female lays several thousand eggs in a shallow nest dug in the gravel. The male then fertilizes them before they are covered over. The adults will now perish, yet showing great tenderness for each other, will guard their eggs until death eventually finds them. But even in death, the salmon are caring for their young. The decaying bodies renew some of the basic nutrients in the stream, helping to ensure a good environment for the young salmon, which will be hatching in 3 to 4 months' time, the beginning of a new cycle. The salmon's obligations do not, however, end there. Even in death, the journey is not necessarily over. The cycle of the salmon is complex, Can we truly pretend to know it in full? There are many mouths waiting, and plentiful food is always welcome. In spirit, the salmon returns to its ocean, where very soon its offspring will follow. Our canoes and boats have always traveled and fished these extremely rich waters. Fish, mammals, birds, all play their role in this bountiful ecosystem, each in its own way taking from and contributing to a well-worked food chain. As part of that food chain, the oyster catcher probably does not realize the complexity and fragility of his environment. But then, how would we know? An intricate web of life extends the length and breadth of our Earth. It has taken millions of years to evolve. Throughout many parts of the world, that web is now broken. Here, on Haida Gwaii, it's still largely intact, though somewhat strained. Our oceans are still bountiful, relatively pollution-free and rich in life. The stellar sea lion, named by its so-called discoverer, George Wilhelm Steller in 1751. Of course, the Haida have known Kai, the powerful sea lion, for thousands of years. Because of its over-playful and slightly aggressive nature, the oceanariums, zoos, and circuses of the world seldom capture Kai for performing tricks, and its relatively low commercial value helped it survive the onslaught of the European fur trade in the 1800s. Pups begin to suckle about half an hour after birth and will take equally from each nipple. Mothers show great affection for their own pups, but are highly aggressive to any others. After 10 to 14 days, the pups collect in pods a safe distance away from the adults, allowing mothers a chance to feed at sea.
They look pretty tough, but they seem to shy away from people. Fishermen don't like them because they eat fish. But they've been around at least as long as we have. Fishermen are probably more of a problem than they are. They're good to eat. The skin's so tough that it could be used for armor. The whiskers were used on the chief's headdresses. Oh, we don't eat them much anymore.
Food here has never been a problem for either sea lion or man. The sea lion can dive to over 600 feet to fish. we can do the same with nets and hooks. The sea lion only takes just what it needs, but also puts something back into the system. That's where the humans and sea lions part company.
There is no good reason why the earth should lose its capacity to provide on our account. We just need to be respectful and consider the generations that will follow us. Today's problems aren't of the ability of the earth to provide. It's that we are demanding too much riches and energies for ourselves. The lesson of Haida culture is that mankind can live and prosper on the earth without having to screw it up. There can be harmony between human beings and the natural world. When we go for food, we're just a part of the natural world, as we were meant to be. Yeah, to change colors too, these things would change into whatever color it needs to. Right now it's excited, so it's red. This is where they're brain is.
Real skinny.
Yeah, see, this is something bit a hold of it. It could still slip away from there.
This one's trying to eat me.
Technology has changed our lives and attitudes within the world around us. But technology today does not reflect wisdom or intelligence.
This is an old sea cave from a different sea level. It would have been hollowed out by the waters, and it looks like somebody was trying to illustrate a story here with there's some ochre painted onto the that white material on the walls, and there's little people on the canoe, 5 little people on there. On this other side there's a person looking quite distressed with a tree growing out of his head, and raven flying over that. And it may have been somebody who went to the forest and became like a wild man, you know, and that's why they put the tree on his head to illustrate that part of it, that he'd become part of the forest. The other paintings on the wall are quite complicated and hard to make out, and at the time when so many people died out, a story like this would have been lost.
People would have camped in here. Mussel shells and some bird bones are remnants of perhaps one of the artist's meal times. These paintings and the significance of them may never be fully understood. As with so many stories, songs, and family crests, much was lost to us in those years of pestilence. It is said that the farther you go for medicine, the more powerful it will be. The wetlands and alpine regions of our islands have always provided us with strong medicinal plants. Medicines were originally brought to the Haida by a magical woman called Skill Jada. The root of the yellow water lily is used for a blood cleansing tonic. With the right knowledge of plants, nearly every illness can be cured. Haida Gwaii's separation from mainland Canada contributes greatly to an abundance of unique plants and animals. But modern settlers have brought with them a variety of alien wildlife. The harmless-looking tree frog has only been here for around 20 years, but has already populated half of the island. Eating many insects, the frogs may be depriving other species of a major food source. Beavers and muskrats like these were brought here for the fur trappers. With no predators except for man, they have flourished, blocking salmon creeks and flooding forests with their dams. Deer are affecting vegetation. Raccoons and rats are destroying bird colonies. As we do not fully understand the intricate ecology here, we have no way of telling what the long-term impact of these imported animals will be on our own species. Born of a gentle maritime climate, rich soil, and an abundance of rain, the trees here knew our ancestors. Many have stood more than 600 years, some more than 1,000. Cedar, Sitka spruce, hemlock, and alder. Haida culture drew its strengths from these forests, using the trees in many different ways. The cedar bark would have been used for baskets, hats, matting, skirts, capes, and ropes.
They cut that part so it wouldn't run away up the tree.
This tree had bark taken from it perhaps 100 years ago. You can see where it was cut and how much it's grown since. You wouldn't want to take more than this for fear of killing the tree. We do not weave so much now as did our ancestors, but our elders still keep the skills alive for us. Jena Kingja means when you're looking into the heart of a cedar. This was done to see if the center was sound enough to build a canoe. If it was not, then the tree came to no harm and would continue to grow. Unfinished canoes lay abandoned in the forest as yet another testimony of the smallpox epidemic. This canoe would have been hollowed out here before being dragged to the shore. But now it is gradually being reclaimed by the forest. It is as it should be. A Haida carver once wrote of the cedar tree, "If mankind in his infancy had prayed for the perfect substance for all practical and artistic needs, an indulgent God could have provided nothing better." Logging companies were destroying our lands and had to be stopped, and so we formed a human barricade across this logging road and fought in the law courts. It was a time for individuals young and old to band together as one and say no more.
Lawful use of property. Will you come with me, please?
With worldwide support, we succeeded. The battle is won, not the war. 15% of our lands are safe. We must now protect the rest. Logging companies are still here managing the forests in the only way they know how, with chainsaws and greed and signboards that mean nothing. Management responsibilities, multiple use, stewardship of the land. They call it sustainable harvest, but it's nothing less than plunder.
We are entitled to what the world provides, but there is no resource that can be taken in isolation. If we take a tree, we've got to consider the birds and the fish.
Thinly sliced salmon, drying in a cedar-built smokehouse, has always been an important food for our people. It keeps well through winter months. The salmon are in danger of disappearing, not only through pollution and overfishing, but also when breeding streams are affected by logging. When forest watersheds are stripped of all their trees, the rain, no longer held by the forest growth, pushes topsoil and silt into the creeks. If this happens, the salmon eggs cannot survive. As well as man, the salmon, in its various stages of development, feed a host of wildlife from freshwater beetle larvae to stream and coastal birds, from other commercial sea fish to sea lions and whales. There are salmon enhancement programs where adults are relieved of eggs and milk. The resulting fry are then captively reared for the first year and then released. A noble gesture, and perhaps the clearest illustration of man's greatest ambition, to see himself as the creator. To allow the salmon to fulfill its place within the natural environment, its habitat must be respected and protected, ensuring healthy stocks for a future world.
And you're cool to be where? No, he's cool to be where?
Haida Gwaii is more than just a place to live. It is life itself, body, mind, and soul. Our ancestors lived within the island's embrace. If we take enough care, it can still provide well for us. The Canadian government lay claim to our lands, although we never signed it over to them. They tell us that the collecting of food is illegal unless they give us a license. We don't always get their licenses. Regulations are supposed to protect our coastlines, but in fact, the opposite is happening. They want to dredge our seabeds for the Guujaaw clan. They want to scrape the rocks clean of abalone, strip the seabed of sea cucumber and anything else they can convert into money. In their system, commercial enterprise takes priority over the well-being of the environment. Our people are part of all that now, but we know our children will live here too. Each generation bears the responsibility to sustain our way of life. Our culture is not simply song and dance and quaint images, but a working relationship with the land and seas around us. Herring spawn here each spring. They come in their millions to lay their eggs on sturdy fronds of kelp. One female can produce 20 to 50,000 eggs and are fertilized by the males in a frenzy of activity. Up until the 60s, herring made up a third of the world's total fish catch, so great were their numbers. Now, only remote places like Haida Gwaii can provide such vast shoals as these. At the peak of spawning, an entire coastline may turn yellow with the milt. The herring and their eggs provide food for ourselves and for many other species. Great quantities of birds will congregate to feed. Cormorants, ducks, geese, scouters all mill together. Gray whales also appear the same time as the herring. Sifting the seabed with their gargantuan mouths, the whales come right into the shore. Not many can resist to stop for at least a moment to watch and admire. Unlike other baleen whales, the gray is primarily a bottom feeder, taking amphipods and small crustacea. Being restricted to shallow waters by their feeding habits, they are easily approached from the shore.
Whales must have always fascinated people. The sheer size of them is intimidating, though I don't know that they've ever hurt anybody. Our people did some limited hunting, but there's so much food around, they didn't have too much need for these guys. During the commercial whaling days of the 40s, they almost wiped them right out. In the last few years, we see them making a pretty good comeback.
Gray whales get on well with other marine mammals. Dolphins and porpoises have been seen to ride on the bow wave created as a gray whale swims. The whale has also been seen to body surf waves similar to the way people do. In the scientific world, whale-human interaction is cited as friendly. But if whales can be friendly to people, surely people should be friendly to each other. This they do very well at the rediscovery program at Lepus Bay in the northern tip of Haida Gwaii.
We call this camp rediscovery. Could as well have been called self-discovery.
I've got 2 blues and then what are you doing?
It's on the old village of Dalungslung.
Okay.
There's no better setting to learn about nature and culture.
There you go. You know how to do it, right?
It's interesting the whole different light in which you see each other. Most interesting is the perspective you get on yourself,
How do you cut it?
especially for the kids who haven't been outside of the trappings of civilization before. You examine yourself and see how you fit into the natural world.
There's no more blade on it. There's no more.
The Haida Nation is the rightful heir to Haida Gwaii. Our culture, our heritage, is the child of respect and intimacy with the land and seas. We owe our existence to Haida Gwaii. The living generation accepts a responsibility to ensure that our heritage is passed on to the following generations. On these islands, our ancestors lived and died, and here too we will make our homes until called away to join them in the great beyond.